Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to The Inner Darkness by Jørn Lier Horst, translated by Anne Bruce. Chapter 5. The shouts alerted Wisting, who was walking at the very back of the procession of 14 people, his thoughts drifting to the next phase of the operation. If Tom Kerr could identify the spot where Tara Norum was buried, he would be responsible for digging up the remains and arranging the forensic examinations. They would have to clear the track in order to drive up in a four-wheel drive vehicle with all the necessary equipment. When he heard the cries, Tom Kerr was racing towards the cart track that led through the woods on the other side of the field. Somehow he had managed to loosen one cuff and it dangled from the other wrist as he ran. He already had a good head start of almost 10 meters when he passed through the opening in the fence. Suddenly there was an ear-splitting boom. Wisting was blinded by a coruscating flash of light and thrown to the ground. Coruscate, to give off or reflect light in bright beams or flashes. Sparkle. Coruscate. Wisting was blinded by a coruscating flash of light and thrown to the ground. Colors in grotesque patterns whirled in front of his eyes, and a cacophony of screams and shouts filled the air. A shower of soil and sand rained down around him after he was buffeted in every direction. With ears ringing, he fought to breathe and had to force each breath down into his lungs. Hauling himself onto his elbows and then all fours in an effort to recover, he was struggling to comprehend what had happened. A young policeman was crawling in panic along the ground, making unintelligible noises. Wisting scrambled up, stumbled over his own feet, and scrambled onwards. Another officer was staggering about, his arms held out stiffly from his body, his clothes in rags, his face covered in dust and blood. Unrecognizable, he lifted his head and looked up before falling to his knees and bursting into uncontrollable sobs. Wisting opened his mouth wide to clear his ears. Someone called out, a high-pitched shriek, and he turned to the source of the noise. Marin Dokken was already on her way to a colleague of her own age, lying on the ground, contorted in pain. Her uniform was ripped to shreds, and she was bleeding from several gashes on her face. Her left arm hung stiff and bloodied at her side. Taking a few tentative initial steps, Wisting surveyed the scene and caught sight of Line sprawled on the ground. He rushed forward, but she was already casting around for her camera as she struggled to her feet. "Stay here," he said, placing a restraining hand on her shoulder. "Don't go anywhere." He remained in that position as he tried to gain an overview of events. Every muscle was tensed and adrenaline was pumping through his bloodstream. His pulse hammered in his temple and the smell of dynamite stung his nose. At the entrance to the woods, a crater had opened up in the ground with the remains of the sheep enclosure blasted away. 2 policemen were sprawled on the ground, writhing and screaming in pain and shock. "Stay here," he repeated to Line. The dog handler shouted a command and sent the barking Alsatian in the direction Tom Kerr had fled, before following himself. Kittle Graham tried to call them back. "The truck could be mined," he warned. At that moment, 2 rapid pistol shots were heard from among the trees, and the dog's barking was cut off immediately. Wisting concentrated on the injured police officers. One of them had struggled into a sitting position and was coughing up clots of blood. The other seemed to have one foot almost torn off. He was no longer screaming, but lay pale and unconscious in the long grass. Hammer arrived and checked his breathing and pulse. Wisting raised the leg with the damaged foot to reduce the flow of blood. As he unlaced the man's boot, mangled tendons and muscles hung from the open wound. Hammer shrugged off his jacket and wrenched off his shirt, tearing it into strips, which he handed over. Wisting pushed a couple of these into the open wound before wrapping the others around the officer's leg and pulling them tight. "I need urgent medical assistance," he heard Graham relay over his walkie-talkie. "There's been a grenade explosion. 3 colleagues are seriously wounded, and at least 4 others have minor injuries." The switchboard was aware of the nature of this operation, and the operator acknowledged the message without asking any additional questions. Several of the other police officers in the entourage had received minor cuts to their faces and noses, and their ears were bleeding. Graham ordered 2 of them back to the minibus to fetch a first aid kit and to remove the weapons stored there. Another took Wisting's place. The police radio sparked into life again, and another, more authoritative voice requested a situation report. Kittle Graham gazed along the cart track where Tom Kerr had disappeared. "We no longer have custody of the prisoner," Graham advised. "He is armed and moving on foot in a southeasterly direction." "We need roadblocks set up," Wisting said. "And the helicopter." Graham lifted the walkie-talkie again and, using his local knowledge, asked for checkpoints to be set up at intersections and other strategic locations. "We also require support from Heli 3-0 and from Uniform 3-0 to be manned," he continued. Uniform 3-0 was the police boat usually berthed at this time of year. "Copy," was the response from the other end. Stiller, his face speckled with earth and sand, had been on his phone. He rounded off the conversation and came to join them. "I've an undercover team taking care of the nearest roads," he told them. 4 units. A radio transmitter crackled. "Ambulance helicopter on its way," the switchboard operator announced. "The emergency medical team is turning out with a doctor and 5 vehicles." Graham acknowledged receipt of the information. Further calls were transmitted over the airwaves, units en route, reporting positions and estimating time of arrival. Graham responded and directed the crews. The situation around them became clearer. Injured officers were taken care of, and there was little else they could do other than wait for medical assistance. Wisting peered down at the unconscious policeman. The shirt material around his ankle was saturated with blood, but the blood flow appeared to be stanched. He looked to be in his mid-20s. His uniform was in rags, and his face splattered with blood. "He'll be okay," Hammer reassured him. "He doesn't have any other serious external injuries apart from his foot." I'm more worried that the blast may have inflicted internal injuries, Stiller said, glancing at a policeman who sat coughing up blood. That it's damaged his lungs. Hammer picked up his jacket and put it on. What actually happened? He asked, glancing around. Walking around the crater, Wisting studied the ground and found what he was searching for. A fishing line stretched across the grass. A tripwire, Hammer commented. He grabbed the line and pulled it up to reveal the safety lever from a hand grenade dangling from one end. He triggered it when he ran through the opening in the fence, he said, pointing. Wisting looked along the cart track where Tom Kerr had made his escape. The dog handler was walking towards them, his hands and uniform soaked in blood from the dogs that lay somewhere behind him. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance. The dog handler turned down the sound on the radio headset attached to his breast pocket and looked around angrily, his eyes fixed on Klaus Thunk, as if all this was the lawyer's fault. He had a fucking pistol, he said, holding up his bloodied hands. Someone had planted a gun here for him. The men Kittle Graham had sent back to the vehicles for first aid kits and weapons had now returned. One of them also had a map, which he now spread out. Wisting stood slightly on the fringes of the circle that formed around it, but managed to find his bearings. He could identify the stream and the dotted line that showed the cart track Tom Kerr had run along. It led to a private road that accessed a cluster of summer cabins on the shore and adjacent skerries. Skerry, a rocky isle, a reef. Skerry. It led to a private road that accessed a cluster of summer cabins on the shore and adjacent skerries. Okay, Graham said, straightening up. 3 men. He pointed to the dog handler and 2 of the oldest and most experienced officers who were still fit for active duty. I want a search along that track, all the way to the water's edge. The 3 entrusted with the task armed themselves with guns, and the dog handler was appointed leader. Graham was about to add something further, but was interrupted by a call from the switchboard. The police chief has called an emergency meeting of key personnel. She has given the following preliminary orders. Tom Kerr must not be allowed to leave the area. He must be stopped by all necessary means. Copy, Graham answered, scanning the faces around him to ensure they had all caught the same message. Klaus Thunk, who had remained quiet in the background, now spoke up. By all necessary means, he reiterated, his voice unsteadier than usual. What does she mean by that? No answer was forthcoming. Metal struck metal as the dog handler pulled back the slide and prepared his gun for firing. The 2 men at his side followed suit, and they marched off. Chapter 6. The camera had been running the entire time. The first paramedics, with kit on their backs, came charging along the track. One was carrying a stretcher. Line followed them with the camera all the way to the scene of the incident. It was impressive how speedily and efficiently the situation was brought under control. In the first few minutes after the explosion, total chaos had reigned. The cries of pain from the policeman whose foot had been shattered by the blast had been agonizing. One man with an injured arm had seemed completely dazed. The task of taking charge had fallen to Kittle Graham. The circumstances had been complex and confusing, but he had quickly gained an oversight of the extent of the damage and shared out the assignments and arranged for the necessary first aid. After that, he had concentrated on the escaped prisoner. It was a vast area in which to hide. 10 years earlier, when Line had worked as a reporter on the local newspaper, she had been here in connection with a search operation for a lost 6-year-old. Volunteers and Red Cross personnel had combed the terrain, also using dogs and a helicopter. Nevertheless, it had taken more than 24 hours to find the boy, exhausted and chilled to the bone, but in relatively good shape. He had crawled out from under a cabin when he heard voices in the vicinity. She zoomed in on her father, who stood about 15 meters away from her. His face was tense. The gravity of the situation was clear to see in the lines etched around his dark eyes and above the bridge of his nose. Through Stiller's microphone, she could hear him talking about the surrounding area. Around 300 permanent residents had homes here. In summer, the population increased many times over with holiday makers. But few of them were here now, so late in the season. Hundreds of holiday cabins lay empty. If Tom Kerr was looking for a place to find cover, but most likely he would try to get hold of a car or boat in order to make good his escape. This meant that everyone living in the area was in danger. Tom Kerr had led the police into a trap and was on the run, armed with a pistol. Pursuing him could easily provoke situations in which he used threats to acquire a vehicle or even as a last resort took hostages. Turning towards her, Wisting looked straight into the camera as if he had only just realized that she was filming. Stiller did likewise. They exchanged glances before approaching her. Line lowered the camera but let the recording continue. "Did you manage to film what happened?" her father asked. "I think so," Line replied. "I was trying to keep Kerr in the center of the camera lens the whole time, but I don't know what actually went on. I'll need to watch it to see what I've got." "When can you send me the file?" Stiller queried. "As soon as I get home," Line told him. Stiller gave her a nod. "You can put the camera away now." "Isn't it okay for me to go on filming?" Line asked. Stiller seemed to give this some thought before pointing at the camera. "Just remember that all the film is owned by the police," he said. "You can't use any of it without our approval." "Sure," Line answered, raising the camera once more. Chapter 7. The rumble of a helicopter could be heard in the east. Wisting checked the time. It was too early to be the police helicopter, and anyway, it was approaching from the wrong side. This must be the ambulance helicopter. He gazed up into the treetops, but failed to catch sight of it. Stiller's phone rang. He listened to a short message before removing the tiny microphone and tugging the cable from under his shirt. "You'll have to come with me," he told Wisting. "Where are you going?" Stiller did not answer. Unfastening the transmitter from his belt, he handed it and the microphone to Line. "Don't follow me," he said. "Where are you off to?" Line asked. Giving no response, Stiller turned to Wisting again. "I need your local knowledge," he said. using his head to indicate the direction of the parked vehicles. The ambulance helicopter now appeared above their heads. As it approached low above the trees, it hovered in the air as the grass flattened out beneath it. Then it landed cautiously on a level patch beside the stream. The rotor system slowed down and a door slid open. 2 men in red overalls clambered out and crept, doubled over, beneath the rotor blades. Wisting made eye contact with Hammer, gesturing to inform him of his departure with Stiller. "What are you doing?" he asked, turning back to Stiller. "He's here somewhere," Stiller said. His subdued voice could only just be heard above the roar of the helicopter. "This could be our chance to find him." Wisting scanned their surroundings. He was not talking about Tom Kerr, but about the other one, Kerr's accomplice. They encountered several paramedics on their way back to the cars. On the open space beside the old sawmill, their vehicles had been driven as close to the track as possible. A grimy white delivery van was parked behind the minibus in which Tom Kerr had arrived. Wisting recognized it at once as a van used for special operations. The last time he had sat inside it, it had been fitted with Lithuanian number plates and the advertising logo of a fictitious construction company. Now it was completely anonymous. Stiller slid the doors open and let Wisting enter ahead of him. A man seated in front of a wall of computer screens reached his hand out to Wisting. "Ove Hyder," he introduced himself without mentioning his professional title or place of work. Stiller drew the door close behind him. Ove Hyder came straight to the point. "I followed him through the woods and out onto the gravel track," he said, pointing at a map on the larger screen. Wisting had no difficulty finding his bearings. He recognized the pasture that sloped down to the stream and the spot where the grenade had exploded. Ove Hyder checked the time. "He was on the move until 14 minutes ago," he said. "Where is he now?" "Here." Hyder pointed at a cluster of buildings at the end of a track, almost at the water's edge. A red pin symbol rested above one of them. "I planted a transmitter in his shoes before he left them. I planted a transmitter in his shoes before we left the prison," Stiller explained, "to be on the safe side." "So that's where Tom Kerr is, then?" Wisting said, pointing at the screen. Ove Hyder handed him a pack of disinfectant wipes. "We have him under strict supervision," he assured them, shifting from the map to a satellite image of the same area, and then zoomed in. Wisting studied the picture while he rubbed the bloodstains off his hands. There were 6 summer cabins with outhouses and adjoining buildings. 12 units in all. The red dot indicated that Tom Kerr was inside an extension to a white painted sea captain's house. 50 meters below, there was a jetty with a sailing boat alongside. "He's been there for a quarter of an hour now," Hyder added. Wisting sat down in a spare seat. He estimated that 33 minutes had elapsed since the explosion. Kerr had taken 18 minutes to reach the nearest cabins. After that, he had been lying low. "You both think he's waiting for someone then?" Wisting said, turning to face Stiller. "That he's waiting for the other one." "He's going to sit tight until everything calms down," Stiller said. "Until the police pull out. Then his accomplice will come and pick him up." "But surely the police won't pull out of the area until all the properties have been searched," Wisting objected. "I know that," Stiller agreed. "I need your help to persuade the chief of police and the top brass to call off the operation out here." A skeptical Wisting chewed his lip. Messages continually streamed in on Stiller's walkie-talkie radio. A breathless voice announced that a pair of handcuffs had been found at the spot where the cart track ended at a road leading to the cabins where Tom Kerr was now located. We can choose to take him now, right away, or we can wait until the other one comes and catch them both, Stiller went on. But a decision has to be taken before the search parties find him. I'll phone Keel, Wisting said, producing his mobile phone. Beep boop boop beep boop beep boop beep. Agnes Keel had been appointed Chief of Police for the new enlarged police district following the reorganization incorporating Telemark, Vestfold and Buskerud regions. Wisting was happy with the choice and the appointment. She had both insight and a good understanding of the role of the professional investigator. Wisting, she said as she took the call. I'm in an emergency meeting with my colleagues. What can you tell us? In his mind's eye, Wisting pictured the various section leaders assembled to advise her on the strategic decisions that had to be taken in exceptional cases such as this. The escape was carefully planned, Wisting began. Everything suggests that Kerr received help. We have reason to believe that the so-called other one is the person who had provided him with assistance. I'm switching you to loudspeaker, Keel informed him. What Wisting was about to suggest was extremely delicate. Who is there with you? He asked to make sure that no outsiders were present. Agnes Keel rattled off the names of the established members of the emergency committee, and Wisting continued. We've located Tom Kerr by use of an electronic tracker, he said, explaining how that had been accomplished. No one at the other end made any comment on what, strictly speaking, was an example of illegal surveillance. We believe he's waiting for further assistance in order to leave the area, Wisting went on. What do you mean? That he's waiting for the police to withdraw from the area so that the accomplice who organized his escape can come and pick him up. What are you really suggesting? Agnes Keel asked. That we alter this from a search operation to a surveillance assignment? We know where Tom Kerr is located. We can wait until his visitor turns up. The police officer in charge of operative details of action broke in. Where exactly is Tom Kerr then? He asked. In a summer cabin, Wisting clarified. It's in a fairly open position, but the surrounding land and vegetation make it possible to observe it from concealed positions. There's a road leading up to it, but the most effective approach would be from the sea. It's about 50 meters down to a jetty from the cabin. I can send you the coordinates. Outside, a helicopter passed over the van roof. The most critically injured policeman was on his way to the hospital. What you're suggesting will require a cover operation, the officer in charge said. We can't just pull out without doing anything. We must be able to demonstrate some activity in the area for the next few hours. This also implies that we will, in effect, deliberately mislead the media, another voice interjected. Wisting assumes that this belonged to the officer responsible for information and communication. The police chief took over again. Give us some time to discuss this further, she said. I'll call you back. Chapter 8. Wisting stared at the red marker on the screen, expecting it to move at any minute. There will be an investigation into this, he said. An internal inquiry. It was your lot's responsibility, Stiller said. Wisting looked at him. He was not interested in doling out blame, but knew that Stiller was right. His police district had been given responsibility for the security arrangements with respect to the conduct of the site visit. The practical details had been assigned to Kittle Graham, who had prepared a comprehensive plan, but the use of weapons had not been approved. I'm not blaming anyone, Stiller went on. I'm just telling you who Internal Affairs will go after. We'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it, Wisting replied. But in actual fact, this should never have been possible. From the moment it was decided to take Tom Kerr out of prison, you should have been checking all of his communications. He should never have been able to discover what day you intended to move him. Then he wouldn't have had the opportunity to plan anything. That wasn't feasible, Stiller explained. We had to arrive at a day that also suited his lawyer. But phone calls and letters should have been monitored, making it impossible for him to communicate with anyone on the outside without it being intercepted. We did do that, Stiller assured him. But we weren't able to supervise his visitors. Who has visited him? A woman he writes to, his brother, and a befriended from the Red Cross. A woman? Wisting repeated. An admirer of some sort? It seems so from their letters, Stiller replied. She could have been the one who smuggled the information and instructions in and out of jail for him. Who is she? Ove Hiddle took out a folder. Lone Melberg, he said, without opening it. 43 years of age, lives in a basement apartment in Hochsund, divorced with a daughter of 18, but she doesn't have custody. She works in a grocery shop, spotless record. How long has this exchange of letters been going on? Wisting queried. For nearly 3 years. Did they know each other previously? No. When did she last visit him? Yesterday. Running a hand through his hair, Wisting realized it was full of soil and sand from the explosion. He should have been denied visits until the site visit was over and done with, he commented. Stiller shrugged in such a way as to suggest that it was easy to be wise after the event. This doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the other one, Wisting added. He could have persuaded her to help him, instructed her to obtain a gun and hand a grenade and how to lay a tripwire. Maybe, Stiller conceded, motioning to Ove Hiddle. Ove Hiddle changed the on-screen map image. We have her under surveillance, he said. A satellite photo from Hochsund showed a mix of houses and industrial areas beside the river Drammen. A red marker was visible in the middle of a large car park. She's at work, Hiddle clarified, moving closer in on the screen image. This is the Kiwi supermarket. We have a tracker on her car. It's in the customer car park. In addition, we have visual surveillance on her, Stiller added. An unmarked car with 2 undercover officers. How long have you been watching her? Wisting asked. Since early this morning. So she could have been here yesterday or last night and made preparations for the escape? That's theoretically possible, Stiller admitted. We're waiting for information from Autopass about vehicles transiting the toll stations. Do you have surveillance on his brother and the befriender as well? Wisting asked. Shaking his head, Stiller explained that this had not been possible due to the lack of resources. We chose to home in on Lone Melberg. She seems the most susceptible to influence. Someone easily persuaded, but it's entirely possible that Tom Kerr has been communicating with someone on the outside by smuggling letters in and out via fellow prisoner's visitor, or even via an employee. It's happened before, and he's had plenty of time to make plans. Outside, they heard the rumble of a heavy vehicle and then car doors slamming. Shouted commands reached in to them. The cargo space in which they were sitting had no windows, but a screen showed what was going on through external cameras. A group of 8 police officers from the emergency squad was in the process of unloading equipment and getting kitted up. Wisting's phone rang, but he let it rest in his hand. "You anticipated that something would happen," he said, fixing his eyes on Stiller. "That he would plan to escape without outside help. This was never about finding Terra Norum. It was always about luring the other one out." Stiller refrained from replying, but darted a glance at Wisting's phone as it continued to ring. The display showed that the call was from Police Chief Chiel. Wisting answered without taking his eyes off Stiller. "We'll do as you suggest," Chiel advised in a steely voice. "We'll catch them both." Chapter 9. The police helicopter had arrived and now circled the meadow before landing on the south side of the old sawmill. Wisting stood ready to greet them. The roar of the rotor blades vibrated through his whole body as the downwash caused the trees to sway and the rippling grass to flatten out. The cockpit door opened. The leader of Oslo's emergency squad took off his set of headphones and laid them down on the seat before striding towards Wisting. Behind him, the crew jumped out and organized their equipment. "Stenberg," he said, taking Wisting's proffered hand. "I've been told you have information for me." "Come with me," Wisting said, nodding. He ushered the officer into the delivery van where Stiller was tracking Tom Kerr's movements. The leader of the local squad, Robert Vinje, was also waiting there. He had been given charge of the operation, taking over from Kittle Graham. Wisting briefly introduced them before cutting to the chase. "Before Tom Kerr was taken from the prison, a concealed electronic tracker was placed inside one of his shoes," he explained. "That means we now know he's located in a summer cabin about 1.7 kilometers from here." He gave the new arrivals time to study the on-screen satellite images. "He had assistance to escape," Wisting went on. "Maybe from the same guy who helped him to commit the murders of which he was convicted." "The other one, Robert Vinje said." Wisting nodded in reply. "Our assessment is that Kerr is hiding in the expectation of help later on," Wisting added. "In other words, the person who helped him with the preparations for his escape is going to come to pick him up. The police chief and her emergency team want us to conduct a mock retreat by pulling out of the area in the course of the afternoon, following what will appear to be a fruitless search operation." The emergency squad leader moved closer to the screen with the satellite picture and nodded, as if approving the plan. "We've 3 officers who have advanced into the vicinity," Wisting continued. "They've been ordered to keep their distance from the building." "Could he have found the tracker?" Stenberg asked, without taking his eyes from the screen. "Could that be a false signal?" Wisting left Stiller to answer. "He has 2 devices on him," Stiller explained, giving information that was new to Wisting. "One in his right shoe and the other inside the back waistband of his trousers. How did you manage to plant them without him noticing anything? That's a body search prior to leaving the prison, Stiller said. In order to record whatever he said during the site visit, he was equipped with a microphone and transmitter on a belt clip on his back. The second tracker unit was attached then. They're no larger than the head of a drawing pin. Overhiddle launched another screen image, identical to the last one. The transmitter in the waistband and the tracker inside the shoe were both located in the same place. We must secure the prisoner, the local operation leader said. Hilda moved to make room for the two men with responsibility for the practical implementation of the operation in front of the screens. They both discussed the terrain, alternative strategic moves, places where they could establish observation posts, and possibilities of intercepting any further escape, whether by car or by boat or from the jetty. Stenberg issued a number of instructions on his walkie-talkie and received answers via an earpiece. Every move he made and every word he uttered were imbued with authority. It took them less than 5 minutes to agree a plan of action. Okay, Stenberg said, heading for the sliding door. We'll set up a command post outside here. Vinje is going to stay there. He looked across at his colleague before turning to face Stiller. You'll all have to be accessible to him. Adrian Stiller nodded. The helicopter is going to return to refuel in half an hour or so, Stenberg went on. It will return and stay here for another 2 hours. The most important thing is that the police boat remains on standby until all this is over. Our crew will be fully informed, but apart from that, we'll keep this on a need-to-know basis. Good, Wisting agreed. Then we'll get a move on, Stenberg said, rounding off the conversation as he slid the door open. He and Robert Vinje stepped out. Their crew stood ready and waiting, and 2 dog patrols had also arrived. Wisting looked around for Nils Hammer, but he was probably still down at the sheep run with Line. Hammer was his second in command, and he was keen for him to be fully apprised of the situation. He took out his phone to call him, but waited before keying in his number. Something about Stiller told him that he hadn't learned everything yet. Is there more I ought to know? He asked. Adrian Stiller hesitated. Not as far as this is concerned, he eventually replied. Let me be the judge of that, Wisting said. Stiller slid the van door closed, and hesitated again before launching into an explanation. We believe that the sidekick has begun to operate of his own bat, he confided. As Wisting sat down again, Adrian Stiller gave him a name. Nana Thomer. Wisting recognized the name from the media. The case was under the jurisdiction of the Ost Police District. She had disappeared one Saturday evening in the middle of July after a night out in Oslo city centre. She had taken the train home to Lillestrøm, and the last confirmed sighting of her was from a CCTV image taken at the railway station. She lived about 500 meters from there, and somewhere along that stretch, she had gone missing. 3 weeks later, a hiker had found her right arm. A hiker had found her right arm in the forest at Svartskog, south of Oslo. A search in the area had led to the rest of her body being found in a shallow grave. Animals had been digging around and unearthed several body parts. This was the same modus operandi that Tom Kerr and his accomplice had used, abducting young women out alone late at night. They dismembered the bodies before they disposed of them. Her body parts had been soaked in bleach. Stiller added. This was also Tom Kerr's favoured method. He had dismembered his victims to make room for the bodies in a bathtub that he filled with a solution of liquid chlorine. Some of the injuries to intestines and urinary tracts occurred when he used the same solution to clean the victims internally. This was done prior to dismemberment, while the victims were still alive. It was an effective method of removing biological evidence, Wisting commented. Another perpetrator could have adopted the same MO. She was mistreated in the same way, Stiller countered. Her nipples were torn off with pliers. The same knots were used to tie her wrists and ankles. Kerr's victims had been tied to a bed in his home while the abuse took place. In all probability, they were not cut loose until after they were dead. A bowline knot with a clove hitch as a securing loop, Stiller elaborated. This was a detail in the case that Wisting could not recall. I see, he said. The other one has now operated single-handedly on one occasion, Stiller went on. We think it's only a matter of time before it happens again. 2 months elapsed from when they took Thea Polden until Tara Norum disappeared, but only 4 weeks until Salwa Haddad was abducted. So you set up the opportunity for Tom Kerr to make an attempt to escape? Wisting asked. To lure the other one out? We considered it a possibility, Stiller conceded. It almost cost the lives of 3 police officers. None of our projected scenarios took into account the idea that anything like that might happen, Stiller said. We thought perhaps he might turn up in a car. That was why we had unmarked vehicles on all the surrounding roads. We never envisaged anything like this. Wisting was not sure how far Stiller would have been willing to go. As the situation now stood, it might appear that everything had gone according to plan. The stakes are high, Stiller continued. Hopefully, the plan will still yield results. Wisting glanced across at the red on-screen marker again. While he was staring at it, it made an almost imperceptible movement, as if Tom Kerr was walking from one side of the house to the other. He lifted his phone and called Hammer. I need to talk to you, he said. Chapter 10. Line, following Hammer, had returned to the open area beside the old sawmill. It had become a gathering point for both the rescue services and response teams. En route, she had encountered the specially trained crews from the emergency squad and the dog handlers with their barking hounds. The police helicopter looped above her head in ever-increasing circles. The injured police officers were brought out and driven off, while 3 ambulances stood by in readiness out on the summer pasture along with other emergency vehicles. The air was filled with the crackle of walkie-talkie radios, the buzz of conversation, and the ringtones of mobile phones. She raised her camera to capture the desolation, anxiety, and bewilderment. 1 hour and 17 minutes had passed since the explosion. The first journalists had appeared and now stood in a huddle out on the road. They were escorted away from the outer perimeter barrier. The alternative would probably have been that the most eager of them would have made their way independently through the woods. Line recognized several of them. These were the ones with the shortest distance to travel, representing the local newspapers in Sandefjord and Larvik, in addition to a reporter and cameraman from NRK's provincial office in Tonsberg. She also spotted a couple of photographers she presumed to be freelancers. She took out her phone to check what kind of information had filtered out. The story was the headline item in her former newspaper, VG. At least 3 police officers had sustained injuries in connection with an operation. One of the leaders on the ground confirmed that there had been an explosion but could not say anything further about what had happened. A map segment illustrated approximately where the explosion had occurred. VG had also been able to report that there was major police activity in the area and that a number of roadblocks had been set up. All traffic out of the locality was being checked and all incoming traffic had been stopped. Morten Plodowski turned up among the other journalists with his VG press pass slung around his neck. He was one of the colleagues she had learned most from and worked best with when she had been employed at VG, but also one of the ones she had most often disagreed with and caused her temper to flare. She was reluctant to let him see her, as this would place her in a difficult position. He would be desperate to know what had taken place, but she had signed a declaration of confidentiality and could not breathe a word. However, it was too late. He waved her across. Any attempt to avoid him now would be foolish. Striding towards him, she gave him a friendly hug and nodded to the other members of the press corps. "You got here fast," she said. "I was lucky," Morten P. replied with a smile. "I was in Tonsberg on another assignment when this message came in." He walked a few paces away from the others, with Line tagging along. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Freelancing," Line replied. "Some documentation work for the police." "What do you mean?" Morten P. queried. "What's really going on here?" "My lips are sealed," Line answered. "If I tell you anything, that'll be the end of any further work for them." Morten P. nodded, his understanding. He was a skinny, ungainly man of around 40, but his eyes were alert and inquisitive. "I see," he said. "We've been promised a press briefing at 1 o'clock. Line glanced at her watch. More than a quarter of an hour until then. "But an explosion," Morten P. ploughed on, taking a step back to study her closely. "Were you there when it happened?" Line looked down at her clothes, spattered with earth and smeared with grass stains. Her left arm was smudged with blood from her father after he had helped one of the wounded police officers. "I have it all on tape," she replied, gesturing towards her camera. "The recordings belong to the police, though," she added, realizing she had already said too much. Once the newspaper knew that a recording existed, the editor and his legal team would argue relentlessly for the opportunity to use it. Line lingered there with the other journalists, but stood her ground inside the crime scene tape that was stretched out around an extensive area. If she crossed it, she would probably find it difficult to get back in again. Unable to see either her father or Adrian Stiller, she concluded that they were probably inside the white delivery van she had seen Nils Hammer disappear into. The NRK reporter was relaying a live broadcast. He describes the police cordon through which they had to pass in order to reach his present location, but had nothing new to add about the actual incident. Dag Bladet and TV2 appeared on the screen, on the scene, followed soon after by a radio reporter from Channel P4. The police helicopter that had occasionally hovered above them moved off in a northerly direction. It was now almost 1 p.m. A few more journalists arrived. Line wondered who would be the police spokesperson. It would surely be Stiller, since the entire operation had been his initiative. However, it was her father who stepped forward. He trudged towards the assembled press corps. Somehow he had managed to get hold of a shirt and jacket that were not soiled with blood and dirt. Both the shirt and jacket were one size too small, and he seemed uncomfortable with the task that had fallen to him. But Line knew that deep down he felt that informing the press was tantamount to informing the public, and the public always had a right to know, at least about events such as this. Line detached herself from the press pack and filmed the journalists instead of her father. She could always access a recording of her father's statement later. What she wanted was the reaction when he began to speak about Tom Kerr. She was standing on her own. This was not like an American press conference, in which all the relevant authorities bunched together behind a spokesperson as if to ensure visible documentation of being part of an important news story or dramatic incident. "I'm going to keep this short," her father began to speak without referring to any notes. "We are still involved in an ongoing operation." The journalists took their places in almost drill-like fashion. The camera crews and those transmitting live images took up the best positions and was then surrounded by the rest of the press members with various kinds of recording devices. The photographers with the longest lenses remained in the background. Line checked her battery. She could keep going for another half hour before she would have to replace it. "My name is William Wisting," her father continued. "I'm here in my capacity as Chief Inspector in the Criminal Investigation Department at Larvik Police Station." He paused briefly before going on. "The Krippos Cold Cases Group had intended today to take fresh measures in the investigation of a missing person from a 5-year-old case. Convicted killer Tom Kerr had expressed his willingness to point out where he had buried Taran Norum. Camera shutters clicked incessantly. During this site visit, Tom Kerr managed to evade the security arrangements that had been put in place. He is armed and must be regarded as dangerous." One of the journalists interrupted the briefing. "Has Tom Kerr escaped then?" "He fled from here at 11:23, her father confirmed. "He was wearing a grey t-shirt, a dark Adidas jacket, blue jeans and grey trainers. Photographs taken of him last week will be circulated." Morton P. was the loudest voice in the crowd facing him. "The messages we received said that a number of police officers were injured in an explosion." Line's father nodded. "Explosives were used in the course of the escape," he admitted. 3 police officers have been taken to hospital. Several others have been treated at the scene for minor injuries. He ignored the questions that began to rain down on him. "What about the volunteer help? How is it to pay? But what about it?" "We must be permitted to postpone publicizing any further details about what has happened. Just let me repeat in conclusion that Tom Kerr is dangerous and armed. The residents of the local area should remain indoors and keep their doors locked. If anyone catches sight of Tom Kerr, we ask that he is not approached or tackled, but that the police are notified immediately. Thank you." He turned on his heel and retraced his steps, finally taking cover behind the parked police cars. Chapter 11. Line kept her camera focused on the group of journalists. She felt rather cynical. This was something that had often haunted her when she worked as a journalist, and her only task in an accident or tragedy was to provide reportage. She had completed her assignment for Stiller and was now filming merely with the idea of using the recordings in a documentary about Tom Kerr and the other one. The already bizarre story had just taken a dramatic twist, and she had unique material in her possession. She let the camera sweep slowly across the surrounding area. Klaus Thonk, the lawyer, stood conversing with Stiller and her father beyond the view of the reporters. He shook his head almost melodramatically before marching across to his car. Some of the journalists caught sight of him and shouted his name. Thonk held up a dismissive hand as he clambered into the vehicle and drove off while the cameras followed him. Line approached Stiller and her father. "Where's your car?" he asked. "It's at Kripo's headquarters in Oslo," Line replied, gesturing with her head towards Stiller. "I was supposed to go back there once Kerr was safely returned to prison." "Take mine," her father told her, taking out his keys. "We need to see the footage of what happened." Line was keen to stay. "You can look at it on the camera," she offered. "Right now." Stiller shook his head. "We're not the only ones who are interested in it," he said. "You'll have to transfer it to a server or something, so that the police chief and Kripo's top brass can also have a look at it." Line sighed. If she had thought to bring her laptop, she could have done this now, here on the spot. "I'd like to stay here until it's all over," she said. "Nothing's going to happen here in the next few hours," Stiller told her. "How can you be so sure about that?" Line asked. "Have you caught him already?" Stiller made no response. "Will you let me know as soon as you have a link for the video recordings?" he asked instead. Line nodded. "Don't give them to anyone other than me," he insisted. "I'll distribute them further." He turned on his heel and walked towards the delivery van. Her father took his car key off his key ring and handed it to her. "He's right," he said. "There's no point in staying here. We're going to have to sit tight for a while yet." Line took the key with an expression that made clear how unhappy she was with the situation. "Okay," she said, adding in a defiant tone. "He went off with my microphone and transmitter. Let me know if you find them. They were expensive." Heading for the car, she turned off the camera before settling into the driver's seat. A branch scraped the side of the car as she drove out along the track. The radio was tuned to P2, not a choice of station. She switched it off and looked in the mirror. Dust from the track whirled up behind her. The stretch through the woods was really nothing but a pair of bumpy wheel tracks with thick foliage on either side. At one point she noticed some kind of rusty agricultural tool on the verge. Line slowed down and stopped. She lifted her camera from the passenger seat and turned on the power again, ready to film the police barriers out on the main road. She noticed a shadow in the mirror, as if someone was moving behind the car. When she turned round in her seat, all she could see was a bird taking off from a branch, as if something had frightened it off. An unpleasant feeling stirred inside her. There was nothing outside the car, but a sudden, irrational fear made her lock the doors. The tires spun on the ground when she drove on again. Soon the landscape opened out before her, and freshly ploughed fields replaced the woods. Out on the main road, 2 police cars were parked. One of them was a blue flashing light. An old blue Fjord had been stopped, and the police had opened the boot. Line drew to a halt again and raised her camera. The boot lid was slammed shut again, and the Ford sent on its way. Another car arrived, this time a smaller Toyota. Through the camera lens, she could see 2 women seated inside it. The vehicle was stopped, and the police checked the driver's documents, opened the rear doors, and checked the boot before the car was allowed to move off. A policewoman had spotted Line, and now her colleague turned around too. The woman kept a tighter grip on the gun suspended from a strap across her chest. Line put down her camera and drove towards them. She stopped at the signal, wound it down the side window, and took out her driving license. The policewoman positioned herself by the door. "We're searching for this man," she said, holding out a phone with a photo of Tom Kerr on the display. "Have you seen him?" There was no need for Line to explain her involvement. "Tom Kerr?" was all she said. "No." "Can you open your boot?" A policeman checked that it was empty and closed the lid again. The female officer handed back her driving license. "Don't stop if you see him," she warned. "Drive safely." Her eyes scoured the terrain on either side of the road as she drove. She kept her speed down. A dog barked at her when she drove past a house on the roadside. She saw some horses in a field and an elderly woman in a farmyard taking in washing. Out on the main road there was another checkpoint. Line placed her camera on the dashboard and let the film run. A number of vehicles were permitted to drive into the controlled area, while others were held back, probably rubberneckers and others who had no good reason to be there or who did not live locally. The car ahead of her was checked in the same way as at the previous checkpoint. Line wound down the side window in readiness for her turn. Once again, she was shown the picture of Tom Kerr before being asked to open the boot, and her car was examined. 25 minutes later, she let herself into her home in Stavern. She walked straight through the house and down to the basement, where she had a home office installed. She switched on the TV. The last channel she had been watching was CNN, and she changed to the Norwegian news channel. Commercials. Removing the memory card from the camera, she downloaded the recordings. The camera had more or less been running the entire time. She had only stopped and restarted to avoid having files that were too large and inconvenient to move around. It was tricky transferring the files to an encrypted server so that she could share them. Stiller would want the raw material. There was no need to edit anything. She sent him an email with a link to the files and an automatically generated password. One of the files was a recording that began just as a minibus parked at the old sawmill and lasted until half an hour or so after the explosion and escape. She let Stiller know the file name and sat down to watch it. There was a great deal of milling around before the procession began to move off. In addition to the footage, she had a sound recording of the conversation between Stiller and Hammer about the helicopter that had failed to appear. They waited for the dog handler, and Kerr and his lawyer had a chat inside the car before they got started. She glanced up at the TV on the wall. The news channel was broadcasting direct from Efton. It did not look as if there had been any developments. She turned down the sound and concentrated on her computer screen, where Tom Kerr and his entourage were making their way through the woods. She had caught the moment when he stumbled and fell. Line stopped the recording, spooled back a little, and played it again. Kerr groaned as he hit the ground. He was hauled up and told to walk on, while his lawyer made loud protests. It was after the next fall that they had removed his leg irons, but this was part of the reason. She replayed the sequence one more time at reduced speed. There was no obvious reason for him to take a tumble. Admittedly, one of his feet caught a tree root on the path, but the actual fall looked contrived. The recording rolled on. The next time Kerr took a nosedive, the fall was more dramatic. His feet were not included in the camera image, so it was impossible to see what he had tripped over. But once you were aware that it must also be part of the plan to make the police remove his leg irons, this fall also looked artificial. The chain meant that Kerr's ability to save himself by putting out his hands was considerably restricted. When he was lifted up again, he had scraped his cheek. The procession moved on. When it reached the slope at the pasture, Klaus Thonk protested, and the discussion that ensued ended in agreement to remove the leg irons. As the clamp around his ankle was unlocked and the chain removed, Kerr stared straight into the camera. Once it was off, he lifted his hands to his face and wiped the blood from the gash on his cheek. Then he said something before putting his bloodied fingers into his mouth and licking them clean. Line wound back, turned up the volume and concentrated on hearing what he had said. It was only a low whisper. She had to play the recording again with the sound turned up. "See you later," was what it sounded like. She played it again. Kerr was staring directly into the camera as he spoke, as if he wanted to transmit a message. This time, it sounded even more like, "See you later." His intent to depart wrapped in a threat.